Welcome to Concept 2 Notes. We're going to talk about the lymphatic system, and I see this system as the unsung hero of our body systems, specifically our cardiovascular or your circulatory and your immune systems. They could not do what they do without the lymphatic system doing all that it does. So this is probably one you're less familiar with, but it's incredibly important. And it's so integrated with the cardiovascular and the immune, so it might be a little tricky some of the concepts since we haven't covered the immune system yet. That'll be next. But just know once we have, you can kind of go back and re-listen and it'll probably make a lot more sense. So just a little bit of an overview as always. What is the function of this system? What does it even do? Some of you literally may have never heard of it, which is totally understandable. It is returning fluids that have leaked from our vascular system back to the blood. So, yes, our body does an amazing job, but it's not perfectly efficient and things leak. And so, because it does this, it helps to maintain blood volume levels, which then in effect affects our blood pressure. The main structures of it are these lymphatic vessels, which are really similar to blood vessels, lymph and lymph nodes. So looking at this picture to the right, the red is just representing oxygenated blood that's being pumped from your lungs once it receives that oxygen into your heart and then out to the rest of your body, so into those capillary beds that are in all your different tissues of your organs, and bringing them nutrients. The blue, if you remember from Unit 4 transport, again, they're not actually red and blue, but just for the sake of the picture, that's taking deoxygenated blood from our organs once we've taken what we need from them, returning them from the body via veins back to our heart, where then the heart's going to pump it in the pulmonary circuit to the lungs to give it oxygen, and then that cycle starts again. So what's new in this picture, because I think we had the same one in Unit 4 I used just without the green, are these green, and these are representing lymphatic vessels. They are intertwined throughout these capillary beds that are in the tissues of our organs, and they're sending lymph back to the heart as well. One thing to notice is that with our arteries and veins, blood can kind of go to and from the heart, out of the heart and arteries and towards heart and veins. But in lymphatic vessels, they're only going towards the heart. So that's something important to note. Okay, so these main structures I mentioned, lymphatic vessels, lymph, and lymph nodes, what are they? Well, your lymphatic vessels are networks of drainage vessels, and that collect and return excess interstitial fluid, so tissue fluid, back to your blood. Once that interstitial fluid gets into the lymphatic vessel, we no longer call it tissue fluid, we now refer to it as lymph. So that's just that leftover fluid that's drained, that excess fluid that contains proteins, and it's what's moving through your lymphatic vessels. So blood is moving through your blood vessels and lymph is moving through your lymphatic vessels. Arguably the most important part of this structure, so you can see the green is all the lymphatic vessels. You see these little dots in here too. Those are representing lymph nodes, which are small organs that act as checkpoints to filter the lymph as it moves through the body. And so these lymph nodes have a huge role in the immune system, which we'll see, because they contain immune cells like macrophages and lymphocytes, which are B cells and T cells, that are critical for our body's immune response. There are also lymphoid organs like your spleen, your thymus, and your tonsils, and then some lymphoid tissues that play really important roles in the immune system as well. And we'll kind of mention those at the end of the notes. So first I want to talk more about these lymphatic vessels. Again, like I mentioned, it's a one-way system. Lymph is only flowing towards the heart. Okay, so you can see in the blue veins and the or venules and the red arterioles, they're going both directions here, but that green is only going to be moving one way. So just like with blood vessels, the smallest are lymphatic capillaries, and those are interwoven between our tissue cells and our blood capillaries. But one of the differences between lymphatic capillaries and blood capillaries is that lymphatic ones are more permeable than the blood ones. so they can take in larger particles more easily, like proteins, which is great, but also like cell debris and pathogens and cancer cells that we're hopefully going to destroy once the lymph reaches lymph nodes. So that's really important as well. These lymphatic capillaries are pretty much everywhere in our body except for bones and teeth, and a very limited and recently discovered presence in our central nervous system. Um, Again, they're more permeable, and that's because they are formed of loosely joined epithelial cells that can easily take in those large particles. And then they also have these mini valve flaps to them that open easily in the presence of increased interstitial fluid. So, one thing that's interesting about these lymphatic vessels is there's no pump to them. Like blood flows through your blood vessels because you've got this heart, which is this giant pump just pushing things where they need to go. That's not the case with the lymphatic system and the transport of lymph. So instead, it moves more slowly and it's propelled based on what's going on around it. So, for example, if skeletal muscles are moving and contracting around it, that can kind of propel lymph through the lymphatic vessels. As pressure changes in your chest when you inhale and exhale, that can move lymph. And then arteries that surround it. So, because they're all intertwined with all the blood capillaries and the blood vessels, they're very close to arteries and things like that. So as arteries are contracting and moving and pulsing, that pulse can kind of move the lymph through the lymphatic vessels as well. Again, also there's valves in there that prevent backflow so it doesn't go the opposite direction. There are some smooth muscles in the walls of the vessels that can contract as well. And then it's mainly, though, just moving because of pressure. So if pressure is greater in the interstitial fluid, that tissue fluid, than in the capillaries, it's going to move from high to low. So they're going to move into the capillaries and push through those little flaps I mentioned. If the pressure is greater inside, those flaps just stay held shut. So lymph doesn't actually leave, but it'll just keep it from more coming in. And again, this is really important. We want this one-way flow, and we want them to be permeable to big things like pathogens so that they can get to the lymph nodes and they can get filtered out. Okay, so lymph is picked up by lymphatic capillaries around the blood capillaries, and then where does it go next? Well, it moves through lymphatic capillaries to collecting lymphatic vessels. Somewhere along those vessels, it's going to be filtered through a lymph node, eventually get to a lymphatic trunk, and then a lymphatic duct before it gets to the heart. So let's break these down. So those collecting lymphatic vessels are really just similar to blood vessels. Somewhere along the way, again, of those vessels, those green lymphatic vessels we see here, are lymph nodes, and that's where we're going to filter the lymph. And then once that it's filtered, those lymphatic vessels are going to unite at a couple places and drain into larger areas, and those are known as lymphatic trunks. Now, all of those eventually lead to two lymphatic ducts. You have your right lymphatic duct, which is going to take lymph in from your right upper limb, the right side of your head, and your thorax. And it's going to take that all in and take it to the heart via your interjugular vein. And then you have your thoracic duct, which takes lymph from everywhere else in the body to your heart via your subclavian vein. And nearly 3 liters of blood fluid is getting recovered by this lymphatic system every day. So we're talking about a lot of fluid that's being moved here. So again, capillaries are all in the tissues of all your different organs, pretty much in your body, except for like bone and teeth, just like your blood capillaries. And then those merge into vessels, which filter through nodes, which merge into trunks, which merge into one of 2 ducts, which eventually send the lymph to the heart. So knowing that pathway is important. So why does this matter? So by returning this excess fluid to the heart, the lymphatic vessels are doing a couple things by doing that. Because we said, again, it's helping with blood volume and blood pressure. But they're also returning leaked proteins to the blood because we said that they're really permeable to proteins. So they can take those in easily. They're carrying pathogens and cancer cells and things like that to the lymph nodes to hopefully be killed by immune cells in the lymph nodes. And they can also carry absorbed fat from our intestines to the blood, which is something I haven't mentioned yet. That's happening in specialized lymphatic capillaries in your intestines called lacteals. But those are just a couple of things they're doing as well. Yes, they are. It's so important that they're helping with blood volume and blood pressure, but they're carrying all this other stuff too. So they're doing a lot of things behind the scenes. Okay, so let's talk about the lymphoid cells that are making up these structures. They're making up lymphoid tissues, and we know tissues make up organs. Your lymphoid cells are mainly just immune system cells. So we're going to see some overlap again in this concept in the next one. We have your lymphocytes, which are the main warriors of your immune system. The T lymphocytes are T cells, and then the B lymphocytes are B cells. Your T cells directly attack invading substances and help in managing the overall immune system and its response. And your B cells secrete antibodies into the blood, which have a ton of different roles that are really important as well. We also have macrophages, which are a type of immune system cell that phagocytize or eat foreign substances, and they also help with activating T cells because they are part of this network of APCs, which we'll talk about in Concept 3. And then also, there are other lymphoid cells that are not immune system cells that are important, one of those being reticular cells. So these make a fiber called stroma, and it creates a network of support for all of the other cells, like these immune ones that are in your lymphoid organs and tissues. Now, when we're looking at your lymphoid organs, so those cells build into tissues, which build into organs, we kind of divide them into two functional groups, your primary lymphoid organs and your secondary lymphoid organs. And if you're in my class, I want you to have out your lymphatic system big body diagram now and label these, and then you can kind of color them as we go as well. But I just want to mention that. So two functional groups. First are your primary lymphoid organs. This is your red bone marrow and the thymus. That's it. That's what we're referring to here. So red bone marrow is in all your bones. Just one bone's pictured here, but we know from Unit 2, support and motion, skeletal systems everywhere. And then your thymus is this structure right here, which we'll talk more about. B cells, those B lymphocytes, those immune cells which make up lymphoid tissues and are critical for the immune system, they're made and they also mature in our red bone marrow. So that's really important. Your T cells, or the T lymphocytes, which are also immune cells that make up lymphoid tissue that have a really important role in the immune system. They are also made in your red bone marrow, but they are maturing in that thymus structure. So that's important. All of these other ones are a part of our secondary lymphoid organs. So that's referring to your lymph nodes, which here are two labeled, but basically all these green ones are marking different lymph nodes in your body. Your spleen, which is right there, kind of peeks around your stomach a little bit, and then mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, also known as MALT. That is including structures like your tonsils, Peyer's patches, which are in your intestines, and your appendix. And these secondary lymphoid organs are where mature lymphocytes get activated. So the primary are where they're going to be made and mature, and then they get activated in these organs, which have roles in the immune system. All right. We are not going to talk about red bone marrow because it has been discussed before in our skeletal system concept and transport, but we'll talk about the primary lymphoid organ, that's the thymus. It's like highlighted right here. This is kind of a clip art of what it would look like, just because we never talked about it before. So its specific function is it's where those T cells mature so that they can actually defend us against pathogens when activated in our immune response. Again, you're like, what are T cells? We're going to get into that in Concept 3, so it'll have a little bit more context for you. Something that's interesting about the thymus, I think specifically, is its key role early in life. Again, so it's located in like the lower part of your neck, but the upper part of your thorax. It kind of almost sits on the heart. So maybe in Unit 5, absorption and excretion, when we did the fetal pig dissection, you may have seen it and been like, what's this thing sitting on the heart? That would be the thymus. And so that's where you can kind of see in this picture where it's located. Again, it's a primary lymphoid organ, not secondary because of structural differences. So it doesn't have follicles and it has a different stroma composition than the ones that are considered secondary. But also the fact that it doesn't actually directly fight any antigens. It's just maturing the T cells that will fight them. It plays an important role, like I said, in early life, but we really don't need it as much after that. So it's actually a really prominent structure in newborns, and then it grows that first year of a baby's life. But then after puberty, it actually starts atrophying. So if you're going to do autopsy of an elderly person who has passed away, you may not even be able to see the thymus anymore because it's atrophied so much. It just kind of becomes indistinguishable with all the connective tissue that's around it. So I think that's pretty interesting to note. All right, now let's talk about these secondary lymphoid organs, and then I think we'll be wrapped up. So lymph nodes, I mentioned them. They're so important. They're located all along the lymphatic vessels in different spots, as you saw in that kind of like full body diagram. We have hundreds of these. They're really small. They're like less than 2.5 centimeters each, that's about like less than an inch each. And then they're just like embedded in connective tissue all throughout our body. You're probably most familiar with the ones just beneath your jawline, like in your neck, because you may have felt them swell up when you've been sick and they're fighting infection. Function is that they're cleansing your lymph, they're filtering it, and then they're also activating your immune system because they have tons of immune cells in them. Most important because I think it's the most important, it's the only structure that's actually filtering and cleansing the lymph, so that's important. Again, it has those dendritic cells which bring antigens to your lymph nodes, and it has macrophages which help destroy pathogens and debris so that they aren't delivered to the blood and then spread all throughout the rest of your body. Looking at their structure, lymph enters the lymph node via the afferent lymphatic vessels, which are all of these along the side. Afferent, think A for arriving. And then we have the outer part, which is the capsule, and then the medulla and the cortex, and then the filtered lymph would leave through the efferent lymphatic vessel, which I think E for exiting. If your lymph nodes get overwhelmed by all that they have to filter and destroy, because they have way more afferent than efferent, so they can get like swollen, bacteria, like pathogenic bacteria can basically get trapped in your nodes as they get backed up on the filtering, and then that's what can cause them to get inflamed, which is when they enlarge and you can know there's like a sign of infection. So if you've ever had like strep throat or something, you can feel those kind of swollen lymph nodes in your neck. All right, the spleen. It's your largest lymphoid organ, and it's located kind of beneath your diaphragm on the left side of your abdominal cavity. And again, it kind of just curls and peeks around the stomach here. Here's your stomach, so you can kind of see it peeking around. It cleanses your blood and removes aged red blood cells or defective red blood cells. It removes debris and foreign substances in its red pulp tissue. These broken down red blood cells do get recycled though, so we can salvage some iron from them, blood platelets, monocytes, which is a type of white blood cell. So we're not just getting rid of them, we're using them. And then the white pulp tissue of the spleen activates and proliferates lymphocytes, which are those B cells and T cells, which we'll talk more about in the immune system. So red and white pulp tissues, those are just the two types of tissues that make it up. I don't care if you know more about the structure of the spleen. And then a fun fact, if you have to get your spleen removed, which is very rare, so like if it gets impaled or something during a car accident, surgeons will try not to remove it because it can actually repair itself pretty well. But if you were to have to get your spleen removed, your liver and your bone marrow kind of take over most of its functions, which is kind of cool. So you can live without your spleen, but it's nice to have it. It does some important things. All right, let's talk about MALT, because that is probably something you had not heard about until today. So again, MALT stands for Mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. It's a set of lymphoid tissues located in the mucous membranes throughout the body. And so when we're talking about MALT, we're referring to these three structures mainly. And what MALT tissues do is they prevent pathogens from penetrating through mucous membranes. Lymphocytes, those B cells and T cells, get activated and proliferated in these tissues. And again, we're referring to tonsils, Peyer's patches, and your appendix as well. So that's going to be what we're going to do last, is talk about those three things. So your tonsils, and your adenoids. So your tonsils are just a ring of malt around the entrance of your pharynx, and that gathers and tries to remove any pathogens from the food that you eat or the air that you inhale before those pathogens could get into your GI tract or your lungs. So it's helping with the immune system here. We can see we've got like normal tonsils, what they would look like, and then if your tonsils get inflamed. Your tonsils essentially are like inviting bacteria to them so that then we could destroy them in that lymphoid tissue with our immune cells, and then hopefully your immune system, your adaptive immune system, would create a memory of that so that it could help fight infection more quickly if you get attacked by the same pathogen again. It's kind of a strategy that your body uses it's like a calculated risk kind of early on in your childhood that would hopefully benefit you later on as you kind of develop immunity towards different infectious agents. However, you know some people that have had their tonsils removed because they've gotten strep throat 20 times. If they repeatedly get infected over and over and they just constantly are getting overrun, you may just end up having them get removed in a tonsillectomy. And then your tonsils, if you get a tonsillectomy, you often get your adenoids removed too. Those are just a type of gland associated with your tonsils that are located kind of higher up in your throat, kind of just behind your nose and the soft palate in the back of the roof of your mouth. And they also are kind of like a first line of defense of as bacteria come in, like your tonsils, and they're kind of trying to attack pathogens in the air that we're breathing in. And again, we'd often remove those if we're going to go ahead and remove your tonsils as well. Peyer's patches. These are just clusters of lymphoid tissue that are in the ileum of your small intestine. And they help to monitor intestinal bacteria populations. Because remember, you have a lot of bacteria that live in your intestines and aid in digestion. But they help to prevent the growth of pathogenic bacteria. So that's really helpful, and we're grateful for that. And then last is your appendix, which is not useless. It does have a role. Yes, you can live without it, but it doesn't mean it's useless. So it's made of malt. It contains a bunch of this lymphoid tissue, and it helps to prevent bacteria from breaching the intestinal wall. And it generates memory lymphocytes for establishing long-term immunity against different things. So you can see, though, what it can look like when it does get inflamed or infected. That would happen if it gets blocked, either by your stool or a foreign substance or potentially cancer cells. And then that would cause an infection, which results in inflammation. And if that happens, it's called appendicitis, and it results in the removal of the appendix via an appendectomy, mainly because it can cause a lot of other issues from it, and so it's just easier to remove it since, again, you can live without it. All right, that is concept 2, the lymphatic system.